Hey there, it's E-Squared Photography. I'm Erin, without Emily today, but I'm here to keep things simple and fun. Are you maybe struggling with blurry photos and maybe blaming it on your camera body? Well, we are here to give you some advice on ways to stop ignoring these certain camera settings. And make sure to stick around until the end because we have something special just to help you out. By the end of this video, we hope you feel more confident with your camera, with the final shots you're getting, and with your camera settings. And for the best photography tips and tricks, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell for notifications of future videos. So just like any beginner and where we started out, we want to easily blame the camera and the gear and have that be the issue. But spoiler alert, that's not always the issue. So we're going to get into some camera settings that you should no longer be ignoring. And you are going to find, and we like to keep things simple, but you're going to find that these are the only settings that actually matter when you are learning photography for the first time. So believe it or not, when we first started out, we were so busy memorizing all of the different buttons on our camera, thinking that we needed to have an understanding of everything and anything, and if something went wrong, what we would need to do. But believe it or not, you don't need to learn all of the settings, but you do need to stop ignoring these specific ones. So let's dive in to the 3 key settings that you cannot ignore. And some of you maybe have heard of this before, but these 3 settings are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You need to master these first. So these are part of what's called the exposure triangle that gives you, the photographer, control over how your photos are going to look, whether it be motion, whether it be exposure or depth of field. These are what are going to help with that. And you will use these 3 settings at literally every single session. So let's first start by talking about aperture so you have a solid understanding, because it is so important to understand all of these 3 different parts in order to become the best photographer that you can, or you will find yourself constantly stuck in the same place. So aperture is also known as the background blur queen, is what we like to call it. So if you look at this image here, you can see all of that nice bokeh is what it's called, or that blur in the background. So 2 things that aperture can help do is control the background blur, and it can also help control light. And actually all 3 of these settings can help control light or the exposure. And that's why we say that they're part of the exposure triangle. Now, when it comes to aperture, the lower the aperture number, so let's say like an f1.4, that's a very low aperture number, the blurrier your background's gonna be. The higher that f-stop or aperture number, so we'll say f6, that is going to give you a background that is more in focus. Now, our go-to settings for, let's say, a family session is going to be shooting at around an f3.5. Now, if we're doing a senior session of just one person, we might be shooting at an aperture of 2.2. Okay, let's move on to number 2, shutter speed. This is where we see a lot of photographers struggle because their shutter speed is maybe what we would say too slow. So we want no more blurry hands in our photos. Maybe something is in focus, whether it be the face or some other part of the photo, but the hands are blurry or something, or maybe it's just all blurry. A lot of times this has to do with shutter speed. It's not the only reason, but it's definitely a possibility. So shutter speed controls motion and sharpness. So if we have a faster shutter speed, that's going to allow for more motion to be going on, right? If there's more motion, we need a faster shutter speed to keep up with that. If there's not, and maybe it's more of a still shot, our shutter speed could be lower. Now, when it comes to shutter speed, we always play it safe when we are shooting portraits, whether it be family, seniors, anything in that in between. We like to shoot at least a 1/250 or higher, just because we like to keep it safe if there is any movement. That doesn't necessarily mean our shutter speed is always at a 1/250, but it does mean it is higher than a 250. It could get really high, but you know what? That's not going to matter because it's going to allow motion to be happening, keeping things in tack sharp focus. All right, let's dive into number 3, which is ISO. And this is kind of the most misunderstood one. This controls brightness in dark situations. So that's kind of how we like to think of it. It's your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. So you would use a higher ISO if things were getting too dark and you needed the photo to be brighter. Now, that can be an issue because then once you increase your ISO too much, now your photos might get a little grainy looking. Now, so we like to stick on the side of a lower ISO, so they are cleaner, they're not so grainy, but this can cause darker photos depending on the light. Now, we typically like to shoot a couple hours before sunset, which allows us to keep a pretty low ISO unless it really does start to, the sun starts to set and it starts to get really dark. So typically we set our ISO to about a 200. Now, one thing about ISO that I just want to point out is that we don't want you to be too afraid to raise that ISO to a higher number if needed, because it's one of those things that you have control over. You would rather raise that than adjust your shutter speed in such a way that's going to cause you to get those blurry shots. Now, let's dive in to some settings that don't really, they don't necessarily not matter, but these are settings that can wait. So if you are just starting out fresh, trying to maybe learn manual mode and the exposure triangle, some settings that can probably wait, but eventually you're going to want to get to and fine tune, but definitely not the time right when you're starting out. So white balance is one. This can be fixed by using something called an expo disc, which we absolutely love. We have a YouTube video on that as well. But white balance is something that if you don't need to right now, just put it on auto, or maybe use an expo disc, but don't stress too much about it. Focus on those main 3 settings because that is what's going to really start to transform your images and you're going to have way more control over them. But also, don't focus so much on different metering modes, color profiles, all of this micro focus things that some people might be looking into. Your camera has so many settings, but understanding manual mode is probably the most important thing when first starting out. So real quick, let's talk about our settings flow at every session. So when we get to a session, so our brain doesn't explode every time we pick up a camera, and here's why. We like to keep things simple. You may have heard that from us before. I know I've said it a couple times in this video before, but we like to keep it simple. So we start by setting our ISO. And we usually set our ISO to about a 200, as I told you before. And then we pick an aperture based on what we're shooting, whether it be a large family photo or maybe just a senior session. And then we adjust our shutter speed to maybe the movement that is going to take place or the exposure that we want. So we always set ISO first, then we set aperture, and then third, we adjust our shutter speed. If we need to make adjustments by adding more exposure to our photo, we personally like to adjust the ISO or the shutter speed. ISO is probably your safest bet, but if you have room to adjust your shutter speed and allow more light to come in by slowing that shutter speed down, then you could do that as well. You just don't want it too slow where it's going to start giving you blurry images. So all in all, if you focus on these 3, you're going to start to see results fast. So you don't need to be all techy to be a photographer. You just need to learn these settings that are actually going to matter right now. And confidence is going to come with repetition after repetition, getting out and practicing. And remember, we're not striving for perfection. It's really progress over perfection, especially when you're learning a new skill. Now, I do want to mention, I hope that this video was helpful, but we do have a more in-depth free manual mode training where we talk all things exposure triangle and really break it down to exactly how we use manual mode in those 3 settings that I just talked about during a session and how we keep it incredibly simple. We'll also go through different scenarios with you so it just clicks and makes more sense. So if you look in the description below, you should see a link to our free manual mode training. And if you like this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and share with a friend so we know to make more videos like this. And we will see you next time.